Hey everyone, in this video we are going to review And of Clay Are We Created by Isabella Allende. We're going to review reading check 1 and 2 in the video. So, And of Clay Are We Created is a very tragic fictional short story by Isabella Allende, but it's based upon the real life event that occurred in Colombia where a volcano erupted and then mud came down on a town and wiped everything out. And there were a few survivors, and people from all over Colombia came and tried to rescue and help these survivors. So, this short story is based upon that real life event. In the short story, we have our narrator, who is the girlfriend or the wife of Rolf Carley. We have Rolf Carley, who is a journalist who goes to the scene, goes to the town, and tries to help and report on what's happening. He ends up trying to rescue Azucena, who is the girl who is trapped in the mud. So, when you were reading this story, it may have been difficult to pick up on the magical realism because it wasn't as evident as it was in An Old Man with Enormous Wings. In this short story, there was an actual volcano eruption. The town was covered in mud due to the eruption. And there was a girl who was stuck in the mud, just like in the original event. The magical realism comes into play after Azucena has been stuck in the mud for a while. They try various ways to get her stuck out, and when they finally try to pull her out of the mud is kind of vacuuming her down, and the magical realism comes into play because Azucena thinks that her brothers and sisters, so the other townspeople who were trapped in the mud, are grabbing her and pulling her down, and that is what is causing her to remain in pain and to remain in the mud. So that is the magical realism in the short story. So now let's review what happened. So going over the questions. Describe the event that occurs before the story begins. After a volcanic eruption, rivers of mud bury a town. What point of view is the story told in? Who is the narrator? This question may have caused you to go back into the text and look and see who the narrator is, because you would want to say Rolf Carley or Azucena, but the narrator is Rolf Carley's girlfriend or wife. It's not specified, and it's in first person. Describe Rolf Carley's efforts to save Azucena. He tries to pull her free. He struggles with poles and ropes. He puts a tire beneath her arms. He tries to remove rubble. He tries to get a pump. How does the narrator try to help Azucena? She calls officials and asks for help on radio and television. At the end of the story, what happens to Azucena? Unfortunately, at the end of the story, she dies. Determining an author's purpose. The three most common broad purposes of writing are to inform an audience, to let them know about an event or information, to persuade an audience to see things from your point of view and to believe you, or to move them to think and do something, or to entertain. Allende took a real event and fictionalized it into a short story. What was her purpose in writing this short story? To figure this out, ask yourself why this subject was important to tell and what she wants us to think about. The author's purpose is to inform the reader about the enormity of the disaster. So she's both informing us and causing us to do something, and to persuade the reader of its horror. By creating the character Azucena, the author is able to draw a more emotional connection for her audience because we see the horror of the disaster and how it affected those within the town. So the author is trying to persuade us to feel as she feels, to see the horror and to feel the horror of the situation, and she's informing us about what happened based upon the real life event. The use of magical realism in the short story pushes the audience to realize that what happened not only affected Azucena physically, but the event also affected other people who were living there and the people who loved those who died in the disaster. So again, remember, magical realism takes a serious subject, something that happened that is not to be taken lightly, and uses that subject matter to make the audience think or learn a lesson. So, using Azucena and including the magical realism of her brothers and sisters dragging her down into the mud, we see how emotional and how sad the event was. Not only is Azucena dying, but other people from that town died due to this event. So, magical realism in the short story emphasizes the loss. So, as we go forward and we start working on our summative for the magical realism unit, think about how magical realism emphasizes a serious subject. And now let's look at reading check 2. What is the relationship between Rolf, Carle, and Azucena? What do they give to each other? What kind of love do they share? So Rolf Carle met Azucena when he came to rescue and to report on what happened. Azucena is a victim. Rolf is her would-be rescuer. She gives him her fears and he gives her encouragement. They share a love for humanity and a desire to help others. What do you think the title of the story means? Like clay, human beings come from and return to the earth. There is utility, beauty, and fragility both in objects made of clay and in human life. Consider Rolf's efforts to help Azucena and what happens to Rolf and Azucena at the end. Then, in a sentence or two, express what you think is the story's theme, its insight, or message about life. The world is full of horrors, but we still find ways to care for one another and value life while facing devastating losses. And do you think most people would have behaved as Rolf Carle does? Explain why or why not. Most people would try to help, but many might become less involved. And then compare and contrast Allende's story with the newspaper account on the same events. Think about how the story is told. Consider especially these elements: the writer's purpose, point of view, tone, descriptive details, figurative language, theme or main idea. And which account do you find more moving? Which do you find more informative? Explain why. So, in the short story, the writer's purpose is to inform, to entertain. And when we say entertain, it's not necessarily to make someone laugh, but to connect and to persuade. The point of view is first person. The tone is emotional and it's very personal. The descriptive details are various. They talk about how they try to get her out of the mud, the town, the characters. Figurative language, it's often used, sometimes overblown. The theme or the main idea: although the world is full of horror, we must still care for each other. And then in the article, the writer's purpose is to inform. The point of view is third person. The tone is matter of fact. Descriptive details, there are fewer than in the short story. Figurative language is not used, as it typically is not used in articles or news reports about an event. And the theme or the main idea is the enormity of the disaster at Armero and how it made rescue efforts hopeless. So I find the short story more moving because of the descriptions and figurative language and the connection that you feel towards Azucena, as well as the characterization of Rolf. The article is more informative because it's more objective and it's more matter of fact. So think about the short story and how the magical realism is included in the short story. Again, it's not as obvious and it's not as in your face as in A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. In this short story, there's a lot of details, there's a lot of figurative language, but the magical realism really occurs whenever Azucena tries to be pulled out of the mud. So you have one targeted event of magical realism versus magical realism that is throughout the story. So as you can see, magical realism can occur in different ways. It can happen once or twice in a story, or it can happen throughout.